We're looking back at this day in local history as we prepare for the country's semi-quincentennial next year. The two Mississippi museums opened to the public 8 years ago today. Former Governor William Winter was among the speakers at the ceremony to open the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum and the Museum of Mississippi History. Also speaking that day was Myrlie Evers, whose family story is told in detail inside the museum's walls. Earlier in the day, President Trump traveled to Jackson and toured the museums himself. The museums had been planned for decades, and they finally opened on the eve of the state's bicentennial. They are operated by the Department of Archives and History. The two Mississippi museums begin welcoming visitors, including the president, on December 9th, 2017. Your look at this day in history.